Hi guys. So here's the next video in my grand tour of the melee dueling combat universe. And now we move on to cubit length combat levers. Now a cubit length is when it's the same length, roughly, between my fingertips and my elbow. And you notice that because of that, frequent use with cubit length levers is as a reverse grip shield that can protect your arm. You see that a lot, especially across kobudo weaponry. So this is a fascinating length of weapon, most especially because as you go down the spectrum of length from long to short, you cross a threshold at this size. Now this is not the most interesting of the two, but that threshold is, it's the first time that you can turn a circle into an X on the inside and not have to keep it outside the perimeter of your left shoulder for fear of cracking up underneath your chin or hitting yourself in the groin. So it's useful for a lot of manipulations that could not have been done with a longer weapon. Now, moving from the other end, moving from shorter, from palm stick through short knife, now up to cubit length. Cubit length is the first length where you really have sufficient length to have heft for parrying and beating your opponent's weapon. Or if you're fortunate enough to have a cubit length against a knife length weapon, you can really get easy access to your opponent's weapon hand and he cannot reach any of your anatomy. That's fantastic. That's really huge. It also, just for a sheer training effect, is the first length where you really can feel the heft as you're manipulating. It feels like you're getting an exercise effect when you train with it. The cubit length lever stretches across cultures and across martial arts styles. The tonfa is a classic one. In Thai martial arts, something very similar called a maisok. And it's essentially a shield because of the fact that it's as long as your cubit. Of course, it can be extended and used as a combat striking implement, but because of the right angle here, when you hold this handle, you're tending to concentrate more on defense than on offense. Now, there's no law that says you can't hold it here or even flip it and hold it here, for sure. So that's an interesting design for a cubit length weapon. Probably the most stereotypical cubit length weapon is the sai, or the jabang as the Filipinos call it. What's really a good sai, if it's properly designed, when you open your hand and let it hang from your thumb, it will hang at roughly a 45-degree angle, which means I've got equal access with my fingers on this side to deploy it, and equal access with my fingers on this side to keep it in a reverse grip. That's a really important distinction. If you go to buy a sai, you want to test it to make sure it's not going to be worthless because it doesn't hang at a correct angle. I've been fascinated for a long time with what the Japanese call a manji sai, and that's where, as you can see, this is typical of a traditional sai, but this hook turns down what would seem to be the wrong way. But actually, to me, it's the right way because it protects my hand in the extended grip, which I really like. I'm obsessed with this particular design of manji sai because it's not beautifully designed to be a handheld cubit length weapon. It's actually designed with this taper to be shoved into a bored out hole on a staff length stick, tamp it down, and now you have a pole length weapon. Very effective and sort of on the borderline between something that's improvised and something that's dedicated. So it would be carried on the belt and in a pinch could be used as a separate weapon for sure, but you've got to watch out for the first law of combat survival with weapons, and that is you don't want this end pointing back at you as you're pointing this end out there. So you want to remember to keep it on a parallel plane and not on your central anatomical plane. Here's another design of those, a better design. This is dedicated for handheld work because this, instead of being tapered to fit into a hole in a staff, is a butt. I would design this differently because this is awkward for thrusting. I would rather have a round back here, but we can't have everything we want. So this is a nice design. This is a little heavier than the last manji sai I showed you. And of course, the Batyam Tao, the butterfly sword of Wing Chun, is another stereotypical cubit length weapon. It's the right length, I love the hand guard. It's completely enclosed. There's very little chance of getting your hand cut or injured. Fantastic weapon, and I think Wing Chun really hit it out of the park with this particular weapon. I like the design overall. Now, cubit length weapons, it's about the first length where you can start getting some other implement attached at one end to where the balance is different, not as symmetrical. For extension or extra weight, this is a comma, a sickle. Good example of that. Things really start to get interesting when you put a bit like on an axe. Now, see if you can tell me why this is not a smart design for an axe. I just talked about the first law of combat survival. When I'm aiming this at you, this spike is coming back at me, right? Not a good design. I keep this to show what not to pick up. Someone bought me a live blade version of this, and it's a completely worthless weapon. I really appreciated them buying me the gift. But this is a razor sharp blade and a razor sticky point that I would use at most for throwing. This would be a fantastic weapon to put in my right hand and throw, but I certainly wouldn't use it as a handheld weapon. Here's an interesting cubit length weapon. It's a balisong dagger. It's a butterfly knife that in the closed position is cubit length, but in the extended position is arm length. This is the actual original length of a butterfly knife. That's a really interesting historical note. A lot of people think this design was just done for daggers, but it wasn't. Here's a Gurkha kukri, very point heavy, typical of a lot of cultures' cubit length weapons, very point heavy to do maximal damage, not good for fencing, not good for manipulations other than killing manipulations. Here is a daga from Filipino martial arts, much longer than a short knife, cubit length. It's got a blade down its entire length. Here's a European, I think it's called a rondelle. This was a spike, just intended for driving into armor on a downed, armored knight. An interesting design. I don't know how useful it is in modern times. Here's an axe, or a hatchet, tomahawk. Classic example of a cubit length weapon with a bit on one end, changing the weight. Can be used with either grip. Here's a bearded axe, it's very similar. I had a trainer for asymmetrically loaded weapons of this design. I'd tape some lead weights to one end, and now you've got to manipulate differently. Now, cubit length is not so long that you get a ton of torque on your wrist. As we start getting out to longer weapons with a weight at one end, it gets more and more important to learn how to manipulate them without hurting yourself, without spraining your wrist. One of the most important things to learn is to keep the heavy end in a smaller area of space and move the handle more than you move the heavy end. And the more you learn to do that, you can manipulate a heavy weapon like a mace or a hammer or an axe much more effectively without hurting yourself, especially if you want to do it one-handed while carrying something else in your other hand, most notably a shield. So I hope this opened up your eyes a little bit about the possibilities of a cubit length weapon. It's a fascinating size in the melee and dueling universe. And the first one that as I'm looking for something I find, I go, yes, I at least got a minimum for parrying and for beating. So see what you can do about training with cubit length weapons.